I just remembered you told me to call you when I wake up, but I had a therapy, and here we are. So, ugh, I bought the book because why wouldn't I? Come on now. Yes. You can watch me on this one because it's my clothes. Zoom out. Okay. Anyway. Alright. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. The sorcerer looks like she's stoned. I'm not, I promise. Okay, anyways. I've never read past this one. So we'll see how this goes. One, The Boy Who Lived. Ready? There's 17 chapters. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Miss Dursley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. They were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Miss Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley. In their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret. Their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear if anyone found out about the Potters. Miss Potter and Miss Dursley were sisters, but they hadn't met in several years. In fact, Miss Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Miss Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work. Miss Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Miss Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. Little tyke. Chortle. I don't know what that word is. I'm gonna say chortled. That's what it looks like. Chortled Mr. Dursley. The house. Oh, God. He got into his car and backed out of number 4 Privet Drive. It was on the corner of the street as he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat as it stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner of the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get in that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in his usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't notice that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on. A few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived at the grunting parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window of his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as an owl after owl sped ahead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was very good, and he was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he'd stretched his leg and walked across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why they made him so uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly, too. He couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurrying up to his office, snapped at the secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter was such an unusual name. He was sure that there were lots of people called Potter who also had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure that his nephew was called Harry. He'd never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Miss Dursley. She always got upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in the cloaks, he found it a lot harder to concentrate on his drills that afternoon. And when he left the building, it was 5 o'clock. He was still so worried that he was walking straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized the man was wearing a velvet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile and a squeaky voice and made a passerby stare. Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who is gone. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day. The old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted in a spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. Even though he'd been called a muggle, whatever that was, he was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. He pulled into the driveway of number 4. The first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted this morning, now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one, and markings around its eyes. "Shoo," Mr. Dudley said loudly. The cat didn't move. He just gave him a stern look. This was not normal cat behavior, Mr. Dursley wondered. Was this normal cat behavior, Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together? He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Miss Dursley had a nice normal day. She had told him over dinner all about Miss Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned the new word won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normal when Dudley had been put to bed. He went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, birdwatchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in the daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping patterns. The newscaster allowed himself to get most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, the weatherman said, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting odd today. Viewers in apartments from Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me instead of the rain I promised yesterday, there had been a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain. Owls flying by daylight. Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place. The whispers about the Potters. Mr. Dursley came into the living room. Miss Dursley came into the living room with 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, have you heard from your sister lately, have you? You haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? He had been expecting Miss Dursley to look shocked and angry after the normally pretend she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there's a lot of funny people looking in town. So? Miss Dursley snapped. Well, I thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Miss Dursley sipped her tea through her pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't care. Instead, he said as casually as he could, their son, he's about to be Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, Miss Dursley sniffed. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty. Common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, Mr. Dursley said, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject and went downstairs to his bed. While Miss Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down to the front garden. The cat was still there. It was still staring down Privet Drive as though he were waiting for something. He was imagining things. Was he imagining things? Could all of this had been to do with the Potters? If it didn't, if he got out that they were related to the pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. Snazzy, I gotta get ready for work.